Hi, everybody. Professor Michael Jahoski here, Thursday, December 3rd, 2020. Today, I'm recording my second Advent video for you, and I have a lot of really great subjects to cover with you, so I want to go ahead and get started. But first, I want to recommend a couple of books that I think you'll benefit from today's session. Then we're going to try to work through things. You'll see I have a bit of a surprise as far as the first topic. Before we get into the real historical birthday of Jesus, which will contrast with the model we talked about on the other day. I think it was Tuesday I recorded it, but that was the traditional date of December 25th and why the church established that, and Advent and the history of Advent. We talked about that already today. Before we get into the September 11th, 3 BC date for Jesus's birth, based on scripture and some other astronomical data, we're going to take a look at a brief tangent that I've designed for us today about a lot of things, but it's really about salvation and sin and the meaning of Christmas, which is related to those two things. Is that we are saved from, we traditionally say, sin. Excuse me, to be freed so that we can go to heaven after receiving the gospel and to be with Jesus and to be in a better world and to get new bodies, including the soul and the heart and the mind, all things included in that in the final day of the Lord. This is a traditional run-of-the-mill gospel presentation, and not everything about it is wrong, but I suggest that scholars like John Walton, Michael Heiser, N.T. Wright, J. Richard Middleton, and many others who are active in the field of New Testament studies and Old Testament studies and eschatology, that is the study of end things, death, judgment, purgatory, heaven, hell, souls, bodies, etc., um, have a lot to say on this issue, and that it could be tweaked a little bit. And I think not all of it is fully biblical. What that largely entails is interpreting the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context, at least the Old Testament, and understanding the New Testament context is quite different than that, but still at least an ancient Near Eastern text. Um, at least that's one step in interpreting this. But what about it is wrong? And how can we maybe look at it from a different way and still maintain a robustly orthodox historical understanding that is ecumenical and merely Christian? I mean that it is not, as Lewis described mere Christianity, as the hallway where all these doors are opened up as denominations and we have to eventually go into one. What I mean is more ecumenical, that it is one that is a blessing and I think correct, dare I say, for all denominations that we can agree on. While I am no expert in all the denominations, I would imagine what I'm going to say would be at home, especially with many Protestants and Catholics, maybe some Orthodox, but not all. Um, but again, this is I leave something like this to the historians who are students and experts in the denominations of Christianity. So as if you've read my book, The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth, you know that I'm wandering right now. I was raised Catholic and then walked away from the church, then got into baby milk Christianity, prosperity gospel, didn't know it, then Protestantism. And now when I wrote the book and published it, when I had finished the manuscript earlier this year, I thought, I want to come back to the Catholic Church. I'm still praying for discernment on that for my family and not exactly sure. So anyway, you know that I'm coming from a very interdenominational, doesn't mean neutral. I'm not neutral. I bring a lot of Protestant, especially probably Anglican perspective to this, high church Protestant, and a lot of Catholic perspective, but not just one or the other. So anyway, moving on from that, the books I want to recommend, and then let's get started with some of these topics. The Lost World of Adam and Eve by John H. Walton. We're going to talk about Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm again today. And I would also recommend J. Richard Middleton's New Heaven and New Earth book, which all deal with the subject we're going to talk about today: salvation, sin, the meaning of Christmas, how it's related to that, Advent and Christmas. Okay. So first we have to kind of start back at the beginning and understand, okay, so how did sin enter into the world? What is sin? And then we'll compare it also with the traditional, inherited, popular Christian, cultural Christian understanding of original sin, see what that gets wrong, and see if we can compare what these scholars are saying to that model, see which one really makes more sense, okay, which is more robustly biblical and historical and true to the context of Scripture. So, Adam and Eve, Walton says, if we understand the Genesis 3 story properly, he says that Adam and Eve really ultimately, in taking the fruit, it isn't that they sinned. Uh, I hope you understand what I mean by that. It's not the act that they sinned, that is the issue. It's what they took in their disobedience. It isn't that they were disobedient or broke rules. Sin is understood as that, at least. It is what they took. It is what sin has done to us. Okay. And sin is a very multivalent concept. We'll see what sin does to us, what this act of taking the fruit has done. And what we took from the tree is wisdom and order and goodness and truth. And we established ourselves as subjectivists, as relativists. We established ourselves as the source and arbiter of meaning and truth and goodness and beauty and justice and wisdom and order. And we said we want to have it our way. And we are suffering because of that as we're born into the world that Adam and Eve created through this choice. We all are born with this infection, if you will, as it goes, this contagion, this taking wisdom and order unto ourselves and establishing ourselves independent of God. It isn't really so much an authority issue; it's that we want to be independent. We want to be, our own arbiters of truth. And this is really what the issue is. And what we took was wisdom. We took it illegitimately from God rather than being related to God properly and being initiated into understanding wisdom, which God was going to give us. But we were too impatient to wait for that tutoring. We then decided that we didn't need to have our beliefs about things rooted in an objective reality. We wanted to be that objective reality ourselves. That is to reify things on our own, to bring our own things into existence, to be our own creators, to establish what we think is true and good unto ourselves, and that is the essence of sin. That is really how we should, getting down to the bottom line, understand the Adam and Eve story. Okay, sin is defined in various ways. After all, during Advent and Christmas, this is what we talk about being saved from. We need to talk about this. It's often described in the Bible as a burden to be borne, as a debt to be paid, yes, as a crime, missing the mark, hamartia in Greek, word for sin, I believe that Paul uses, and it is used in the Gospels, if I'm not mistaken, means failing to achieve an objective. You see it in Proverbs 8:36 as well. But Walton suggests that perhaps we might wish to speak of what sin does rather than what sin is. What sin does is it results in alienation. As I said, as we created our own um, objective ground for our own values rather than to root it in metaphysical reality, rather to have the grounding for our ethics be in God's character and nature, which is truth, goodness, and beauty. We wanted to create our own truth, goodness, and beauty, to define our own cultural norms and values as absolute truth for ourselves. And in doing that, what sin does is it alienates, it separates, which is probably why we see such a great theme that we can relate to of exile and suffering and return in the Bible. Okay, we see that from the story of Adam and Eve onward. Excuse me. Sin is also a threat to relationship with God. That is, it separates us and alienates us from having a relationship with God, which is what he intended in the beginning. Heiser says that the reading of Genesis 1 and 26 and 27, verses 26 and 7, tell us that God had a divine counsel, as Psalm 82 tells us. Not Elohim or divine beings that were equal to him. And this is not polytheism, but those that were subjugated to him, that subject to him, like us in the natural world and the animal world, that were contingent on him for their existence and for their consequences of their actions. Okay, imperfect beings like us that were spirit beings, but not human beings. So non-human, spirit beings, and that possessed free will, like the serpent in the garden. Okay, and that God says to his council in Genesis 1:26, "Let us make mankind in our image." But then in verse 27, we're told that God created us in His image alone. We are not made in the image of any of the lower gods, but of God Himself, true God, the true God and true light. So Heiser says that this is an important thing to consider because we were, in understanding the divine council context, going to be like gods. We were going to be brought into the divine council. That's what it means to be in relationship with God, to be co-heirs with Christ, as Christ says, as Paul says later of Christ. And it's important that we understand that from the Old to the New Testament, we see that theme, but then we interrupted it. We prevented God from allowing us to be made like Elohim, for us to sit on the council with God as his co-heirs and as his stewards and to bring order to the world. We wanted to do it our way. And so we were alienated from God. We were not brought into God's family. And so now the nations have been scattered and our sin has separated us from God. God wants to bring Eden back on his own terms. He wants our help to do it, but he'll do it no matter what. And he wants to make us part of his family. But we have to want to do things his way and to go back and try to undo what our ancestors, our first pair, did, is to our archetypal pair, I should say. There were other humans, according to a reading of scripture, and what scholarship is saying today is that there were other humans. Adam and Eve were the archetypal pair. They were walking with God in the cool of the Garden of Eden. And so we want to be brought back into the presence of God. We were exiled from the presence of God because of what we did. We want the nations to be reconciled through, as we'll see eventually, the role of Israel, which was the reconciler of all nations, to bring them back to God. Then God had to come and do it himself. And he's inaugurated a kingdom and began to establish the antidote to the disorder we brought into the world through Jesus Christ, to bring us back to himself if we will just participate in our sanctification with him. So I've just kind of summarized the whole Bible for you there, and what was at stake, what was lost by not by taking the fruit, not that we sinned, but what we took and what this sin did to us. And so, yes, we did something wrong. We didn't trust God. We weren't accountable, and we were innocent. That is, evil existed and suffering and death existed before this happened. After all, kind of Satan implies it in his, in the serpent, I should say, implies it in taking, in his talk to Eve. And the fact that there was a tree of life in the garden tells us that, well, why would a tree of life need to be there if we were already immortal? Well, that should tell you something. So we knew what good and evil were, but we weren't accountable yet for it. This is the reading that Heiser and Walton give. We weren't accountable, and now we are. And now we are, since we wanted to do it on our own, we're accountable to God for what we've done, and we have to try to make it right. But we can't, because we didn't listen. We didn't trust God's timing. So it wasn't just an elaborate test. There's part of this reading of Genesis 3 involves a test, but that's really not what it's about. It's about not a paradise lost, Walton says, but a paradise ungained. We lost the privilege to being within reach of the antidote to evil, suffering, and death. We had access to it, and now we lost it. Okay. So this is what we are being saved from. We're being saved from ourselves. Sin is disequilibrium, and we are the reason why disorder was brought into the world. So now we need to talk a little bit about these concepts of non-order, order, and disorder, okay? And I can't get into all that Walton says, but according to his reading of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 in an ancient Near Eastern context and his extensive knowledge of Hebrew, he says that we need to understand that Genesis 1 is not the material creation of the cosmos. It's the story of its functional ordering. The material creation of the cosmos already took place out of sight, out of mind. God obviously created this, but the Bible, the authors didn't know how he did it. They just know that he did do it. Obviously, he did it. But now God has this world that needs to be given function and order, and everything needs teleological purpose to move toward an end and a purpose to fulfill. And it didn't have that until God began to say, let there be light, right? So God's Genesis 1 activities is about establishing order and function. This is what bara in Hebrew, he says, means. Okay, so that's what order is centering, it's wisdom, it's justice, it's good. Okay, which isn't the absence of error or flaw, but it means a purpose. Okay, it means a purpose. Non-order is what the world was before he started ordering it, right? Before things were assigned its purpose. So it's neither evil or good. It's without, it just exists. Okay. And so we look at the sea that God's spirit hovers over in Genesis 1. First of all, this presupposes that God already made the material cosmos, but more than that, it's symbolic that the water is a symbol for non-order, chaos, for something that needs to be marked and bordered and controlled and given purpose, which God then does, gives borders to the waters. Okay, so that's non-order. Now, non-order would also be suffering, disease, would be natural disasters, which when taken a close, nuanced look at, and predatory animals and prey, there is an argument here to be made that there are some things about this that is good. As hard as that is to admit, we would never say that while we're grieving or suffering. And importantly, these examples of non-order are not the result of being sinful, naughty, evil creatures. That is the most important connection. That is everyone's biggest gripe, and for good reason. That's bad theology. But that's not what's going on here. Okay, non-order is just something God wasn't allowed to go through with his plan of ordering the creation with us. We screwed that up. So God had to come himself because Israel failed ultimately, but I should say, yes, she failed, but she's still redeemable, and she's still doing her work through the church and through the nation of Israel, I believe. So anyway, non-order and order, and God, since God was kind of stymied from bringing about order, there is still non-order. But those aren't the only two things that exist in the world. We also live in a world of disorder. And this was brought about by the Nakash, that's the word for serpent, snake, which was a divine being and not just a snake. In fact, not a snake at all, according to Heiser. May have been Satan. The jury's out with whether I agree with Heiser on this. His extensive reading is that there wasn't just one towering figure of evil, but many. But certainly the snake was a chaos creature in the Garden of Eden. He was neither evil nor good, but he did direct his goals toward twisting and contorting, and so ultimately is judged based on his actions, and is seen rightly so as a creature of disorder, but originally was a creature of non-order. But what he did was seduce Eve to thinking that God was not to be trusted, and God was not going to make us his family, and that we wouldn't die, no, but we would understand the consequences and be accountable for our actions if we did this. And Eve took it anyway. And as a result, disorder was brought into the world. That is, now there is this attempt for us to wrest in our dependence on God away from him, and to say, okay, we don't want to be dependent on you. We want to be independent. So partly an authority problem, but as I said earlier, not really. It's more about wanting to be independent. And that brought about disorder, according to Walton. Okay. If you want to understand the difference I was saying earlier, about the material creation of the cosmos, the Bible elsewhere implies that God made the house. The universe is always described as a house. God made the house of the universe already, but Genesis 1 is really about building the home. It's unpacking the boxes and putting pictures on the wall, he says. Okay. To decree, God's oral decrees, we should understand as him assigning a function. Okay. In this non-ordered state that we began with, God began to establish order by decree. Ordering did not eliminate natural disasters, pain, or death. All non-order will only be resolved in the new creation. In Revelation 21, we're told, in fact, there will be no more sea, a symbolic way of saying there will be no more non-order, or pain or death, which are all part of the realm of non-order. There is no temple in Revelation 21 because God's presence will pervade it all. Revelation is not, the Bible explains, Walton says, restoration of Eden, or a pre-fall condition, as if we were immortal and perfect before the fall. That was Augustine, or St. Augustine's idea, excuse me. Um, that's not what the text says. Okay, so we're not getting restored to a pre-fall condition, or that would be back to a non-ordered world. No, we're being risen to a fully ordered world through the cornerstone that is Christ, who came to inaugurate that plan. So that's what we're headed towards. Okay, with people as the source of wisdom and justice and goodness and truth, instead of God, the result was not order centered on them, but disorder in which sin reigned. Okay, so we can't fix this problem. We need saving from ourselves. This is what Christmas is all about. God coming into the world to establish this order again and to march us toward a process by which he draws us to himself, to draw us in as co-heirs with him, to work for the establishment of justice and healing and peace and goodness and truth and beauty in the world, to bring creation to its fulfilled, ordered state, which was prevented by the fall. Okay. And when eventually, through Christ's intervention on the cross and the resurrection, and our help, or with or without it, God will eliminate all suffering and death, all disorder, all non-order, and there will only be a world of order. Romans 8:19 through 22, famous passage, tells us that our state of delayed order and the existence of non-order and disorder in the world, creation is groaning as in the birth pangs, and we're waiting the world of the fully ordered world that Jesus began to introduce this antidote when he came, his first advent into the world. We thought we could do better than God. Heiser and Walton words it like this. Both agree this is a delusion that still plagues us all. This is the story of Genesis 1 through 3. Now, this idea about sin reigning and the original sin, this idea of the notion of how sin spreads to all human beings and how sin affects the cosmos. We've addressed how things like disease and natural disasters are not the result of sin. That is not because we're bad or evil and God is punishing us. I remember Bishop Robert Barron mentioned the story of a Japanese governor back in 2010 or 11, I think it was. Japan had those horrible catastrophes with the factories and the tsunami, I believe. And one of the governors had said it was divine punishment. Well, no, that's bad theology. No, this is not the result of disorder or sin. It's a result of non-order. The creation is still groaning. God was not allowed to finish his plan. Now, you might be thinking, there is God, is there a rock so heavy God can't lift? Is God limited? Well, no, yeah, I guess in a sense, he's not limited, but he can't do anything contradictory. He can't force us to do anything. And he created a world in which this is what reality is. So when we say, we prevented God, well, you might say, well, how could we prevent God from bringing order? Why didn't he just override Adam and Eve? Well, that would have resulted in automatons. It would have resulted in cosmic rape of sorts, of forcing himself on us. And you might say, well, that just doesn't make any sense. Well, I think it does. If you really spend some time thinking about this, which I can't do for you, but think about the story, meditate on it, reflect on it prayerfully. Um, God, we were given a task. God had every intention of sharing wisdom with us. The tree of knowledge of good and evil and life was in the midst of the garden. We had contingent immortality. So long as we didn't do anything that would have killed us, we would have continued to have access to life evermore, and wisdom and truth and goodness and beauty. But we wanted to do it our way. So God banished us as a consequence of that. He had recruited us to be part of his family, and we didn't want to do it on his terms. I don't think that means God is limited. I think that God is he set the rules and he's honoring them. So I understand this might be an issue for some of you, but think about it. Let's address this issue of original sin, though. So St. Augustine and Irenaeus both wrote about this in their writings. Augustine went further than Paul, Walton says, and Paul went further than Genesis, but Augustine really took this too far in saying that it was passed down from generation to generation through sex and through fruitfully multiplying, and that sin and disorder was an infection that was handed down from one generation to the next, and that we were born into the world with this infection and taint and had to pass it on. Irenaeus, on the other hand, so in the Augustinian model, the world is infected because we are infected. That is, it's our fault. But Irenaeus wrote kind of a la Pandora's box in Hesiod's story from Greek mythology. Hesiod was a Greek poet who wrote about Pandora, which was a jar. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Box is more fitting. Everybody knows it's Pandora's box. Anyway, here's what Walton says. He says that the Irenaean model says we are infected from the world that got polluted because of that first act. So there's something in the water and the air, so to speak. So I'm going to read something from Walton here. He says, if we consider the model in which there were humans, either preceding Adam and Eve or contemporary with them, which Genesis 4:14, by the way, seems to indicate Cain, who killed his brother Abel, knew that there were other people. We need to contemplate their vulnerability to suffering and death. Were people before and during Adam and Eve's time, if they existed, prone to suffering and death? The answer is yes. But if death and suffering can be feasibly inherent in a non-ordered world and retained partially in an ordered world, then any pre-fall human population would be subject to them. So I think it's very clear, with the tree of life being there, among other things, the idea that there was a tree of knowledge of good and evil already, that there was suffering and death, and that the fact that Eve would have suffering in childbearing, there's no reason to expect that she would have, because she was human. She was never created immortal ex nihilo as an angel or as a spiritual being. She would have probably experienced pain even before this, but this would be even more painful outside the garden, is the understanding. Well, he says this. He says, if, as Paul asserts in Romans 5:13, sin is only charged where there is law or revelation, then this human population we're speaking of would have been in a state of innocence, is what we were saying earlier, not sinlessness. That is, we had the ability to sin, and we had the possibility that we did. That is, that we did wrong, but we had access to wisdom and access to life. We were in a state of innocence. We weren't accountable, even though we were in the image of God. In this scenario, we would expect to find predation, animal death, human death, and even violent behavior. Endowment with Imago Dei and initiation of sacred space would provide the foundation for accountability through law and revelation. When Adam and Eve sinned, Walton says, as representative archetypal priests for humanity, their sin brought disorder and accountability and made the antidote to death inaccessible, the tree of life. This disorder infects each of us when we come into existence. Non-order is not being resolved according to the original plan of God teaming up with his vice regents, us. In disorder that we brought in as a result of not trusting God and not leaning on him for his plan, and choosing to do it our way, brought the need for resolution through the work of Christ. You might also ask at this point, that's the end of the quote, how can this be a good world? Well, good in the Hebrew doesn't mean perfect, he points out. And so we have to demolish this idea that the world was we were immortal, we were living in a perfect golden age. That hasn't happened yet. That's the new creation. So if we look at the actual story the right way and the origin of the cosmos and humanity, we might have questions about the goodness of God until we look closer and what God is able to do. And we've addressed both of these things, but the story now should make much more sense when you think about the details, okay? Well, as I say in chapter 2 of my book, Christianity, the gospel, is a story of already and not yet. It is, we've been given a solution for disorder through the work of Christ on the cross, but disorder still remains and non-order still remains. We need to remember that the not yet portion is the resolution of non-order and the purgation of disorder and the establishment of order that's yet to come. We live in this in between two moments. We had contingent immortality before the fall, but we were not created to be immortal. Only God is perfect. Only God was immortal. And apparently not even the divine Elohim and his council were immortal. So if they weren't, we weren't. Only God is perfect. Only God is good. Only God is true love and truth and light. We are not. And we lost access to that when we were banished from the Garden of Eden, from sacred space, from the presence of God. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we are saved to. We are saved to a world where we are invited to work with God, to one day be part of his council, to be co-heirs with Christ, to make the world a better place. To tell the true story of the world, we have to have the biblical worldview and understand it properly, be part of it, and realize that this story gives us the things concretely that we need to do in life, whether it be charity and love and building a family, or if you're single, to build a community of friends and a network where you are reaching out and helping people tell this story. And I mean, just help me fill in the blanks here. All the things that we humans do to, in our own sense, make the world a better place. The Bible has a room for that and so much more. This is what we're called to do. Our destiny is to be part of God's counsel, to be co-heirs with him, to be part of the new creation, to be in a new world order. But we have to accept Jesus as our Savior, and what it means to do that is not just to confess Jesus as Lord, as Romans 5 says. I forget the verse off the top of my head, with our mouth, but it also means to receive the status as God's image, and to wake up to knowing what that means, and to let the Bible define who and what we are and what we're built and made for. And it means to be known through our behavior, not just our beliefs, that we are Christians, that we are God's image bearers, and that we are co-heirs with Christ, and to be known by our deeds, not just our beliefs. I don't think we're just saved by uttering a proposition. And I don't think we're just saved from works. We have to walk the tightrope of faith and works. And there's so much more to say this. There's great books on formation of Christian discipleship and fruits of the Spirit and things that we need to do. In my own life, what this looks like is education and spiritual formation and writing to help people understand the gospel, to get the right story, that we need to tell this story over and over again, and live this story, realize that God is telling us this story and we're part of it. And so this is what my own calling is. And to manifest that through not only caring for my family, but God's church, and for people who are not believers, and being a sounding board for people who have questions, and helping people struggle and come to terms with life's ultimate questions. This is how I'm helping. How are you helping? Okay. So in the remaining session here today, I want to talk about, we're not even gotten to my book yet. We're going to be saving that for last. I want to talk about the actual birthday of Jesus. I'm going to just go ahead and put it that way. I'm not going to talk around it. I won't make apologies for it. I think that Heiser's right. I think that the people he quotes are right. I don't think that we're done looking at this subject. I think there's questions that I have about the dating of Herod's death and whether we're right about that. As we'll see, according to Heiser, recent data shows that we thought Herod the Great, King Herod, might have died in 4 or 3 BC, but now it seems more likely that he died in 1 BC, and that we now can combine that with this new data about Jesus's birth from a reading of the Bible, and we understand now how things fit together a little bit better, possibly, or maybe we'll find something. As with all theories, this is an ongoing conversation. We might find that we're still missing something. But I think based on the argument that he's provided, this is very, very, very persuasive. And considering what we talked about last time, the December 25th Sextus Julius Africanus had, come from the point of view that the incarnation, the date of the conception of Jesus was March 25th. He mentioned this. Where did he even get it from? We're not even really told, excuse me. 9 months forward from that, and the battle with the Sol Invictus cult with the Romans, and the Feast of the Saturnalia, and all of these decisions seem like strategical decisions by the church, mythical decisions to build bridges between the myths, to show that Christ is the myth made fact and completes all these other stories, and that it was chosen symbolically to celebrate the birth of the Son, and literally the birth of the SUN and the SON. And it seems like more of an inclusivistic decision than it was a historical decision. We talked about the reasons why that was on during the last session. So according to Dr. Michael Heiser, our starting place for determining the answer to the September 11th 3 BC proposed date for Jesus. We can look at Matthew 2, and you can look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1 and 2, and get an understanding. There are some things we talked about on during the last session, excuse me, about when Jesus was born. We mentioned the shepherds, for instance, and some things about Herod and the wise men, but this doesn't really give us enough data to compile an answer, especially for December 25th. And in fact, if anything, it makes us just not really know where to plop down and put Jesus's birth. So we have to look elsewhere. And he starts us off by looking at Romans 10, 5 through 18. Now, I'll pull this up so we can read some of it. I may not read all of it, but he says this. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth, it was verse 9, Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. And then Paul quotes Psalm 19. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Interesting. Psalm 19, verse 4. Okay, so we need to unpack this a little bit because obviously it is dense. So here's what Heiser says. He says that in this reference that Paul makes to Psalm 19 about how people have heard how could they hear about Jesus without being preached to? He says that the heavenly bodies, if we go to Psalm 19 and read the rest of it, is a way that God has communicated his presence. This goes back to Romans 1, 18 through 20, about there are certain qualities of God that are known through the natural world and through our conscience. And this is what Paul's alluding to with Psalm 19, is that we know God, even if we are not part of the covenant, and that there are ways in which God speaks to us. And so he turns this into a platform to talk about a field of studies called astral prophecy or astral theology. That is, that the night sky, the stars and the planets, the sun can communicate certain things about God who made the celestial objects in the heavens and made them to be signs and seasons and to mark time. God could use them to communicate to us. This goes all the way back to Genesis 1:14. So from here, he invites us to go and look at Revelation 12, 1 through 7. And he believes that this is a rare example. Sometimes it's hard with dream and vision literature like Revelation and Daniel, that the text is actually saying exactly what it says and that it means exactly what it says. Revelation 12, 1 through 7, he believes has, since this is about a woman in the sky and a dragon ready to devour a child, it's obviously about the Messiah coming into the world. He believes that this text can be brought to bear on Matthew and considered with some other scriptures and parts of understanding the story of the Bible. We can work through this field of astral theology to determine a correct date, a historical date for the birth of Jesus. Let me read, Genesis, Revelation 12, 1 through 7, then we'll break it down. And then there are some other biblical ideas and passages that are linked to what we just talked about with Adam and Eve that we want to delve a little bit more closely and carefully into, that are also going to help us understand this text of Revelation 12. Because as we were talking about, God coming into the world at Christmas is God's answer to sin. It's our salvation. I want to further that a little bit more and give you some more details, okay? Because Genesis 3 was not the only rebellion. There were two others, at least, mentioned in the Bible. And there is more at stake than we realize with God coming into the world to save us. And there's more explanation than most people believe the Bible gives for why there are so many illicit things in the world and why there's so much evil and suffering and death brought about not through non-order, but through disorder. So we're going to deepen that in a minute. But this is Revelation 12, 1 through 7. And it reads, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head." So an enormous red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its heads, excuse me. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. He was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This is a reference to Psalm 2, which is a messianic psalm. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. And then there's more, of course, but this is where we're going to end our reading of Revelation 12, 1 through 7, as astral theology, or prophecy in this case. Before we start parsing out who the woman is, we obviously know the child was the Messiah and who the dragon is, and some of the constellations and planets and astronomical data that this text implies. I want to mention that this is an answer to not just the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, but to the Nephilim, to the giants, as the word Nephilim in Aramaic, I believe in Hebrew, refers to them as giants, and to fallen council members. Remember, we talked about the divine council, Psalm 82. So the Nephilim are sons of God, Elohim. That is, they were divine council members that sat on God's divine council, that were dependent on him, had free will, were not perfect, that descended, according to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and to the Dead Sea Scrolls literature of First Enoch, which expands on Genesis 6, 1 through 4, that these sons of God, these Elohim, these lower gods, came to earth and mated with women and shared illicit arts and knowledge with them. And Enoch actually expands on this because there's only 4 or 5 verses. I think it might be Genesis 6, 1 through 5 or 1 through 4. Read through the 5th verse just in case I'm wrong. I'm not looking at it here right in front of me, but that's all we get. First Enoch explains that this was really an expansion of the Genesis 3 issue. That was one divine rebellion led by the divine serpent, who was a divine person, being, as we saw. That was snakes in the ancient Near Eastern world were often a sign of a divine presence. Well, here, these are divine beings that have rebelled against God. First Enoch, I believe, expands and says that Azazel is one of the demons' names, one of the fallen gods. They're not angels. Okay, this is important. Angels are in a different, even lower category as messengers, malak in Hebrew, that are not related to the sons of God. Okay, so these sons of God descended to earth at Mount Hermon, which is in northern Israel, where Jesus later asks Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" and talks about not the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. Now, when he was referring to the gates of hell, he was referring to the fact that in Jewish mythology, Mount Hermon was seen, Mount Hermon, excuse me, was seen as the entrance to the underworld and the site where this descent happened in Genesis 6 and as described in First Enoch. So Jesus was referring to topography and geography when he was talking there in northern Israel, which is pretty cool. Okay, and Jesus was declaring war, saying, "I'm here to reverse the damage done." This is the important point Heiser's trying to make. We know about the Adam and Eve stuff, but in the Genesis 6 and First Enoch, God is saying through Jesus, "I'm here to reverse the damage done by these fallen deities, these lesser deities, recall, right? Not polytheism. This is henotheism. There's a high God that is like no other, and everything is dependent on him. but he created not just human beings, but non-human spiritual beings as part of his family. That's not the same as polytheism. Anyway, read Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. You'll get a perfect explanation of all of this. It really is one of the best books I've ever read. Okay. So God, through Jesus, is answering the fall of these, the rebellion, the second rebellion of these junior divine beings. There's a third rebellion. We're going to get to that. Now, after Genesis 6, we know that there's the flood story. And Noah and the flood is a response to the Nephilim. The Nephilim are the descendants of these matings and these intermarriages, forbidden intermarriages between these spiritual beings and human beings. And the Nephilim are all but wiped out. Although there is sort of the case to be made that there are still descendants that live on after the flood, according to Heiser's book. But the point for us, we'll stop here, is that this second divine rebellion, Jesus has something to do with it. And Revelation 12 and the Gospels together are telling the story through through the Christmas story, that the Christmas story has something to do with answering this demonic descent of these fallen beings at Mount Hermon. And I think that's pretty powerful stuff. And there's just incredible evidence in the Gospels for this and in the Old Testament. If you read Heiser's books, Reversing Hermon and The Unseen Realm, your eyes will be open to a whole new understanding of Scripture and help you appreciate how the early church and ancient Israelites read their Bible in a whole new way, which should be our goal, to read it the same way that they read it. Okay, so there's more to this, though, because just really quickly after the flood, man tries to reclaim sacred space on his own terms again. We still haven't learned. And we build the Tower of Babel. And then God says to the divine council members that are still present, he says, let us go and confuse in Genesis 11 their speech and scatter the nations. Later, Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 explains the fallout of Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, a third rebellion. That God, as a result of the scattering of the nations, this is even before Israel is called in Genesis 12 through Abraham, God has assigned his junior Elohim that are still there as a judgment against human beings wanting nothing to have with the true God. He says, okay, fine, have these junior beings, and this nation can have that junior being, and that nation can have that junior being, and I don't want anything to do with you since you don't want anything to do with me. Rather, I should say, God wants something to do with us, but he realizes he can't force himself on us. So he hasn't vacated the premises. He's still here. He just will not force himself on us. And as part of a divine judgment on these rebellions, to maintain justice, this is what he does. And I think that's just and fair and true. And yet God is still accessible to those who will seek him with all their hearts and souls, Jeremiah 29 tells us. So Genesis 11, Genesis 6, 1st Enoch, Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. This provides some of the Old Testament and Dead Sea Scroll context for the Gospels and the Christmas story, and Revelation 12, which is further New Testament evidence that sheds context on the Gospel story, where we're going to come back to the Gospel story in a second. Let's parse Revelation 12. So what we're seeing is that Christmas is a big deal. It is an answer to the sin of Adam and Eve. It is an answer to the Nephilim and the fallen sons of God at Mount Hermon in Genesis 6 and 1st Enoch. It is an answer to the Tower of Babel and the disinheritance of the nations and the assignment of junior Elohim or junior gods to these other nations in Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. And God is coming into the world to reconcile the nations. Now, just before I move on, there's one last thing. In Genesis 12, the very next chapter after the Tower of Babel, God calls Israel, and that is through Abraham. Eventually, Israel comes through Abraham. He calls Abraham to start a nation through whom all the nations of the world, Babel will be reversed. Adam and Eve's sin will be reversed. That's the hope, at least. And that the answer of the fallen junior gods will be reversed. And we know that the story of the rest of the Old Testament is Israel trying to live up to this, but not being able to. And eventually God comes in Jesus to do what Israel could not do, because Israel now needs a savior, and God had to rescue her. And through her, and especially through God's intervention, and all through God's intervention, Israel and the world will be reconciled to God. Beautiful. So, what does Revelation 12 have to do with the birth of Jesus? Well, it tells us when he was born. The woman is Mary, or even better, Heiser says, faithful Israel, who was a virgin of Zion in the Old Testament in 2 Kings 19, Isaiah 37. It makes more sense to say virgin Israel since no one would have known about Mary's circumstances anyway, he says. It needed to be decipherable to Jews at the time who didn't know about Mary's comings and goings. So it's best to see the woman in the sky as faithful Israel. The woman is described in the heavens, which is a stock language for constellation speak, and clothed with the sun, and the moon is at her feet. She's a constellation, she's a heavenly sign. This is the constellation of Virgo. The sun being in the midst of her constellation, the only time of year this could happen is the appearance of Virgo, when the sun is located between about 150 and 170 degrees along the ecliptic. And it occurs for only about a 20-day period each year, and it would be about in the center of this sign. This 20-degree spread could also indicate a general time when Jesus was born. Virgo is associated also in pagan culture with the mother goddess who produces divine kings. And so hence sort of this being all about the true myth, right? Is that this is a sign for the pagans and the Jews, the Jew and the Gentile, and God is there to reconcile, keeping in mind that the Gentiles are the disinherited nations of Deuteronomy 32. It matters what they think too. God is coming to save us all. So the child is obviously the Messiah. We saw the reference to Psalm 2, verses 7 through 9. Now, that's an easy one. This is Jesus. The dragon is a bit more complicated. So we know that dragons and snakes are symbols of divine beings. The dragon in the Bible, like Leviathan, Rahab, was also seen as a chaos sort of sea monster. The nations that stood against God and Israel can also be seen in light of the dragon. The dragon is defeated in Psalm 74, verse 13, Psalm 89, verse 10, Isaiah 51:9, and then again later at the day of the Lord. So the dragon is sort of a recurring motif in the Bible and in Dead Sea Scroll literature. Now, astronomically, the two major candidates for the dragon are Hydra or ancient Scorpio. And while both make sense, Hydra and other experts say that ancient Scorpio would make the most sense. And since Hydra isn't precisely on the ecliptic, Scorpio is. Hydra is kind of adjacent and below the woman, not directly under her feet, but Scorpio is. So Scorpio seems like a better candidate. The constellation directly above, by the way, the head of Virgo, is the zodiac Leo, which is the lion associated with Genesis 49 and the tribe of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob. Important to both Jew and Gentile, it was the chief sign of the zodiac, and Leo was also dominated by the Regulus star, known as the king star. Now, this combination of astronomical signs, which we just talked about, Scorpio, Virgo, Leo, is only known to produce a unique set of circumstances that can be accounted for one 90-minute window on September 11th, 3 BC. And I know that there are some observatories that probably have shows that can bring it back to a certain date. I know I had a friend that once could do that, which would be cool to see the night sky on that time. To see all this, there's probably an app where you could simulate this. I know Heiser mentions it in some of his YouTube talks. There's further evidence, though, that Jupiter is also important. And that is, we can also look at the night sky at this time and see that Jupiter, whose star was known for its retrograde motion, that is its appearance of movement back and forth in the night sky, that Jupiter's first conjunction with Regulus began back in September of 3 BC and then continued on a couple days after, from the 14th through the 11th, or I'm sorry, the other way around. On the 1st of December in 3 BC, it stopped its normal course through the fixed stars and began its annual retrogression. In doing so, it headed toward Regulus, and then on February 17th, 2 BCE, the two were reunited. And all of this timing seems right for the birth of Jesus and the journey of the Magi, which would have been, the journey of the Magi would have been about a year or so after Jesus was actually born. So he was an infant. Matthew 2, verse 11 uses the Greek paideon as opposed to brephos, which is used in Luke 1:41. The former, paideon, can be used of an infant or a toddler. The latter is used only of newborn infants or children in utero. So it means that Jesus would have been a few years old by the time the Magi were there. The Magi saw the star rising above the eastern horizon on August 12th, 3 BCE. The Jupiter rose as a morning star, which soon came into conjunction with Venus, he says. If the Magi began their own journey toward Jerusalem at this time, the apparent westward motion of Jupiter each day could have indicated to the Magi to proceed in the same westward direction. The fact that there is, and this is all beyond me, folks, I'm getting this from top scholars that he's quoting from, the fact that this is known and can be studied empirically and dated with great precision is inspiring. And if you can understand all this association of Leo, Virgo, Scorpio, Jupiter, and how this all points to a very specific an hour and a half window on one date, and that then a gap of time after that can account for the arrival of the Magi, is amazing. But the most amazing part, and then I think we're going to finish, and I'm going to do a third session on my book and how it relates to the Advent and Christmas themes. Let's wrap up with the most, I think, extraordinary revelation, which is that September 11th, 3 BC, in the Jewish calendar, lunar calendar, would have been the month of Tishri 1, which means that this was Rosh Hashanah, which takes place during September or October in our calendar, but Tishri is a month in the Jewish calendar, Tishri 1. This was a Jewish New Year. It was the oldest version of the New Year, even older than Passover, which was the springtime New Year. There were two New Years, just like we have different ways of reckoning time in the calendar and different fiscal year and school year. The Jews had two as well. Rosh Hashanah was the start of the harvest season, and it was also the Day of Trumpets on Tishri 1. It was the celebration of the renewal of creation, and according to Jewish legend and mythology, I should say, not legend, Jewish mythology, Rosh Hashanah and Tishri 1 was the day of creation. That is, a trumpet was blown for the new year to announce the day that God had made the world. So this trumpet was blown also to pronounce God's judgment of all people, which was expected to fall on that day. It also came to be associated with Solomon and his descendants for the inauguration and coronation day of the Jewish monarchs. So it's very messianic. It's associated with new creation and old creation. And this would have been the day Jesus was born. Do you think that he was born on a propitious Jewish date? I think so. And then died during Passover. I think this is quite profound. If you think about the implications, Noah's birthday was also apparently Tishri 1. And if you want to get more into the Nephilim and how the Christmas story addresses the sin of the Watchers, that is, those fallen junior divine beings, look into Heiser's explanation of how the Noah symbolism fits in here on your own in his book, Reversing Hermon. It's quite detailed and good. It's another added layer of symbolism, but I just want to stop with the revelation that he was born on Rosh Hashanah. This is an incredible revelation, if true, which seems likely. This has profound messianic implications and can be dated and substantiated by astronomy. And the astronomical symbolism is kingly and messianic. And apparently, Revelation 12 is a description in astral theological terms of Jesus's birth. And these things would have been known to the ancients, who were great stargazers and students of the night sky. So I'm not surprised at all, Jew or Gentile. This is an incredible revelation, and it gives us precise historical and scientific pinpoint for the birth of Jesus on September 11th, Tishri 1, Rosh Hashanah, the year 3 BC, which means that Herod would have died a few years later. So Jesus was born, and the Magi came to visit him when he was young. And then the Magi were told by Herod to tell Herod where he appeared. We know that they didn't listen. They went on their own way. So Herod ordered the massacre of innocents. Jesus was a few years old. And so Jesus and his family, Joseph, was warned in a dream in the Gospel of Matthew to go to Egypt, where they flew as quick as they could and got there to remain safe until Herod had died. Okay, so this would make sense that a few years after the years of Jesus's birth, it could also mean that Herod maybe died in 1 AD. There's no year zero. So this would make sense too. I wonder if any scholars out there would correlate this with the census of Quirinius in the Gospel of Luke and see if any archaeological, data could further shed light on the significance here. In any event, it makes sense. And recent numismatic data apparently is a study of coins showing that Herod may not have died in 4 or 3 BC, but a little bit later. As we know, Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, and that Herod died before Jesus was very old. And as we know, after Herod died, Jesus and his family did not return to Bethlehem, but to their hometown of Nazareth in the Galilee, and went their way there. So this is the Christmas story. We've talked about so much today, and I hope that you've learned a lot. And look at these books on your own, read them for yourself. The next and final session for Advent, my special 2020 Advent series of lectures and talks, although I wish I could get some of your questions, please post them in the comments below. I'd be happy to hear from you and would love to dialogue with you. Follow me on my WordPress blog, and please, you can find me if you just go on WordPress. If you download the app, you can look for the Last Dunedin blog or just search by my name. You can also find it on Google. If you follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, you can also ask me in one of the comments below for the website address, and you can subscribe to my WordPress blog. And we can communicate that way, or on social media platforms. There's lots of ways to get in touch with me. I would love to hear from you. When we come back, we're going to talk about how my book takes in an imaginative direction through Tolkien's writings the theme of Advent and Christmas, the birth and return of the King, Jesus Christ, and how that's good news, what that means, and why we should care. So I look forward to our next and final session on Advent, and God bless you all.